Hello, my name is David Cross and I'm an artist and academic at the University of the Arts London. Today I'd like to introduce a new knowledge exchange project at the Horniman Museum. The Horniman Museum is located in South London, in Forest Hill, away from the smoke of factory chimneys, but within reach by horse and carriage of the West End, the City of London and the London Docks. The original stone building was designed as a museum by the architect Charles Harrison Townsend. The museum collection, the building, and the grounds it stands in were all dedicated in 1901 as a free museum for the public forever. The museum houses an outstanding collection of anthropological artefacts from different cultures around the world, while an amazing collection of over 1,300 musical instruments informs a broad programme of live music events. The Natural History Gallery features the most extraordinary display of taxidermy specimens in their original Victorian glass cases, giving a powerful sense of how people once viewed the living world around them. I especially enjoyed the fascinating aquarium displays with illuminated tanks of live fish and corals cultivated as samples of ecosystems from around the world. Putting the beautiful plants and animals in context, the museum has added educational information and questions about plastic pollution, climate change, and the loss of biodiversity. In a heated tropical indoor garden, there are free-flying butterflies, with rare species of butterfly from around the world, including the Horniman's swallowtail. From the Horniman Gardens high on Forest Hill, there are magnificent views over London. Architects and urban designers Studio Egret West are developing a master plan for the Horniman Museum and Gardens to deliver its strategic vision as London's only museum where nature and culture can be seen alongside each other. 3 key aims include attracting 1 million visitors a year by 2023, developing its audiences to more closely match London's diversity, and engaging these audiences in interconnected global issues such as climate change, biodiversity loss, and migration. The history of the Horniman begins in the 19th century with John Horniman, a successful tea merchant. Horniman was a Quaker, a movement of the Christian religion that rejects formal worship and hierarchy and is opposed to slavery and war. John Horniman retired in 1869 and devoted his time and fortune to philanthropic work, including the Peace Society, the Anti-Slavery Society, and the Howard League for Penal Reform. By the 1890s, Horniman's became one of the largest tea trading businesses in the world, so that when he died in 1893, John Horniman left a personal estate of £320,000. In 2019, that would equate to around £40 million. John Horniman had invented ways of mechanically packaging tea in airtight tinfoil packages. At that time, tea was sold loose and was often adulterated with dyes or cut with other leaves, so Horniman's innovation of pre-packaging tea to ensure its quality, weight and freshness was an immediate success. According to historian Jessica Wright, the adjective pure was used in order to reassure the Victorian public that Horniman's tea would not put them at risk of contamination from the Orient. Packaging was a way to construct new, tangible boundaries counteracting the national borders that were becoming more and more porous through the growth of foreign trade. That foreign trade depended on ships sailing around the world to collect not only basic goods like grain and timber, but precious cargoes of silk, wine, spices, and tea. This photo shows the docks on the River Thames in the east of London, where vast quantities of goods were brought in from around the world. The British East India Company had been hugely influential in establishing the political and physical infrastructure for this global trade. This engraving shows the East India Company's headquarters in Leadenhall Street in the City of London. The British East India Company was a private corporation, which the Crown had granted the power to use military force. By 1803, at the height of its rule in India, the British East India Company had a private army of around 260,000 troops, twice the size of the British Army, and it used this to conquer and govern large areas of India. Actively participating in the slave trade, the British East India Company gained control of half the world's trade in spice, cotton, silk, indigo, saltpetre, opium, and tea. The British East India Company was notorious for its military violence. But it was only after it showed a particularly brutal use of force, suppressing the First Indian War of Independence in 1857, that the British government finally took over the direct rule of India and sustained the project of colonialism in the form of the British Raj. The historian Rajkamal Goswami writes, "Using arguments of science, social improvement, and economic and industrial development, the British colonial government appropriated, accumulated and reserved vast stretches of forests, village commons and farmland for setting up tea gardens in Assam. The British colonisers dispossessed people from their farmland and forest through a combination of physical force, laws and finance. Next, they brought in labourers from eastern and central India who were often forcibly recruited or indentured, which meant that they worked in a system of unfree labour based on unfair debt. Using the land for plantations to produce crops for Britain involved neglecting or breaking up existing systems for managing water and storing food for local people. The result was that under British colonial rule, a succession of famines occurred in India, resulting in the deaths of many millions of people. The first time I gave this presentation, I included here a photograph from the Wellcome Library of Historical Images. The photo showed people who were suffering from starvation during the famine of 1876 to 78. But people in the audience said this raised complex ethical issues that needed more time to draw out, so I suppressed the image. I also showed this photo and speculated on how the different expressions on the people's faces conveyed something of the power relations of colonialism. But again, people in the audience said that drawing such inferences was not a reliable way to understand the historical situation. What was not disputed is that using the great wealth amassed by his father's tea business, John Horniman's son Frederick travelled widely in Burma, Canada, China, Egypt, Japan, Sri Lanka and the United States. In his travels, Mr. Horniman collected objects which either appealed to his own fancy or that seemed to him likely to interest and inform those who had not had the opportunity to visit distant lands. From the age of imperialism and industrialism to the consumer society and its consequences today of the global social ecological crisis, the meaning of the Horniman Museum and its collection is continually changing. Since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels has been accumulating in the atmosphere and is now causing climate breakdown and accelerating the mass extinction of species. The ecological crisis caused by industrial society might be understood as the collapse of the conceptual boundary between nature and culture. In April this year, Sir David Attenborough introduced the BBC documentary Climate Change: The Facts with a striking statement. He said, "It may sound frightening, but the scientific evidence is that if we have not taken dramatic action within the next decade, we could face irreversible damage to the natural world and the collapse of our societies." But whose societies is he referring to? In the majority world of the global south, societies are already being pushed to breaking point, partly by the effects of the consumerist lifestyles of people in the wealthy nations. Experts in international relations avoid using the term climate refugees, partly so as not to incriminate nations causing climate breakdown, but also partly because ecological breakdown is genuinely just one of many reasons why people become displaced. But clearly, the mass migration of peoples within countries and across borders is increasing the urgent need not simply for practical aid and support, but also for intercultural dialogue and understanding. The Extinction Rebellion is capturing the public imagination and shifting the limit of acceptable discourse away from sustainability towards climate emergency and ecological crisis. After an Extinction Rebellion event in London in April this year, these women were interviewed by The Guardian online, and I was struck by what they said. If this had been anything but Caucasian people, there would have been armed police officers and a big problem. We know that the climate crisis is impacting first and worst on the peoples that did the least to cause it. And it's clear that the system that makes London so wealthy it can play with consumer lifestyles also produces extreme inequality, leaving billions of people far less able to adapt to ecological collapse. But as Frederick Jameson said, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. In this image, the Sony Corporation invites us to play in a survivalist adventure. In this scenario, industrial society has collapsed, and people leave the city behind, making their way towards a romantic landscape of resurgent nature, where we, the viewers, are already positioned. The Last of Us is an interesting title, posing questions about who we are and our relationship to the past and the future. What is the role and purpose of a museum in this time? The discipline of anthropology is undergoing critical self-reflection within a wider interrogation of the structures of knowledge that gave rise to colonialism. Meanwhile, in the art school, the debate around intersectionalism is enabling people to explore the multiple aspects of social identity. Awareness is growing too that the ecological crisis cannot be addressed separately from the urgent struggle for social justice. So what can artists and designers contribute to this rethinking of cultural practice? This diagram comes from a wonderful paper by Kate Raworth of Oxfam titled A Safe and Just Space for Humanity, which proposes a social foundation of human rights and an environmental ceiling of ecological limits. As the historical project of colonisation systematically deprived people of their rights and dignity, I think the political project of decolonisation is a key part of building a social foundation. Similarly, as the fossil-fuelled industrial consumer society has constantly pushed against ecological limits, I think the process of decarbonisation is a crucial part of learning to live beneath the environmental ceiling. There are countless possible approaches to the Horniman project, but whatever you do, I urge you to acknowledge and explore these boundaries and to think creatively, not only to prevent climate collapse and mass extinction, but to positively advance ecological regeneration and restorative social justice. I really look forward to working with you and seeing your ideas, so we'll speak again soon. Bye for now.